Global Axess 2015 handlar om krig. En kraft som både bygger och river civilisationer. Vi frågar oss vad som driver en väpnad konflikt, vilken roll kriget har spelat i skapandet av samhällen och vad det säger om den mänskliga naturen. Elisabeth Kendall är Senior Research Fellow i arabiska och islamiska studier vid universitetet i Oxford. Hennes nuvarande arbete undersöker kopplingarna mellan militant jihadism, konst och litteratur. Kendall har bland annat forskat på ungdomsaktivism och al-Qaeda-poeter i Yemen. Här samtalar hon med Niklas Ekdal.
If you look at the map of the world, it's hard to escape the observation that the Muslim world from Mali to Pakistan is especially affected by war. As an expert on Arabic and Islam, what do you make of that connection?
Well, I think we have to be careful not to imagine that simply because these are parts of the Islamic world that equates with war. However, we also need to recognize that there are extremist elements within Islam that we are not successfully combating currently. I think there are many reasons for why we're not successfully combating those extremist elements. But number one would be because you cannot do it militarily. You have to wage that war via hearts and minds.
And lack of cultural understanding.
Exactly. A lack of cultural understanding is a key need to address in order to win hearts and minds.
And the term jihad in itself has come to be used as a byword for fanaticism or the Islamic world's alleged hostility towards the West. You think something has been lost in translation there?
I think a great deal has been lost in translation, yes. Jihad, if you go back to its original Semitic root, jahada means, it comes from the root to strive or to struggle in the path of God. And that struggle can take different forms. The two forms that are usually talked about are the greater jihad and the lesser jihad. The lesser jihad, the less important one, is the military struggle, or it's the struggle to defend one's faith against aggression. The much greater jihad is the one that goes on inside you. That's the jihad against sin and evil and fighting your desires and temptations inside. But of course, today the term has been appropriated and used by different groups very much in the concept of the jihad that's a military struggle. And that's a small part of its original meaning.
And does that go for the so-called Islamic State as well? That they have a different concept of the word jihad than more traditional groups?
You find the word jihad endowed with a great variety of militant meanings. I think your example of Islamic State is at the incredibly extreme end. Whoever would have thought a group would emerge that made al-Qaeda look soft and good? But in fact, al-Qaeda has in some areas, such as Yemen where I work, managed to seize the ground that Islamic State has offered it, in a sense, by managing to appear less extreme, more friendly, more tuned in to local values than Islamic State. Suddenly they're the good guys.
And al-Qaeda, in turn, they made movements like Hezbollah or Hamas look pretty soft in their days, in the 90s.
Yeah,
so,
that's true.
So is there a kind of escalation?
I think that's a valid analysis. Yes, I would love to say no, but it looks like that. It looks like in order to grab headlines, in order to make a point, in order to win new recruits, you have to be ever more excessive.
Right.
Feels like that.
And you see that as a sort of a media phenomenon primarily, or a traditional Islamic phenomenon?
Oh, that's a difficult question, because of course if you look back through Islamic history you can always find examples of excess and fight, as you can in non-Islamic history.
Sure.
But I really don't think this is something that's inherent within Islam. Okay, so although there were difficulties between Sunnis and Shiites, there's sectarian wars. For many centuries, also these groups lived happily alongside each other. It's not an innate part of Islam.
And the Arab Spring was a big hope and a big story in 2011 to 2013. What's the connection there between the Arab Spring and concepts of jihad, for instance?
Well, of course, when the Arab Spring initially emerged, the so-called Arab Spring, I think many people now call it Arab Winter, there were great hopes for what Western commentators, I think, perceived as the style of democracy that we understand, a multi-party system and free elections. And people were very quick to say it's the end of jihad. You know, this is the beginning of something we recognize as democracy, and it's the end of something that we've been watching for years, which is this jihadist movement. In fact, this was just before I was completing a book called 21st Century Jihad. And the publisher was saying, well, you know, I'm not sure we want this anymore. And I had to write the case saying it would be very stupid to think that jihad is now dead. It always goes peaks and troughs and peaks and troughs. We have to be careful. And of course, groups like al-Qaeda, and as we know now from Osama Bin Laden's papers that we found in his compound in Abbottabad, were already working out, how do we seize this movement? How do we manage to harness our own agenda onto an unhappy population that wants change? How do we steer it in a direction that matches our desire for caliphate, for example, and not Western-style democracy? And we got too excited too quickly.
Right. And speaking about Osama Bin Laden, poetry was one of the tools that he used.
That's right. That's right. A prolific poet.
And yes, and what was he writing about when he wrote his poetry?
Well, he wrote about a great deal of issues. What really strikes one about his poetry is the way he manages to blend many features from the poetic tradition, both Islamic and pre-Islamic, with what was going on in contemporary times before he was killed. So he managed to put his own agenda into a very robust classical format that would, I think, lend it legitimacy. The most famous poem that most people who are interested in jihadist poetry would know was his ode, which he wrote to the bombing of the USS Cole.
Warship in Aden.
That's correct, yeah, the warship in Aden. It might surprise people to think that leaders would still take the time to write a poem to glorify their own acts. And in his case, also to then recite that poem at his son's wedding, I think shows just what a prominent place cultural production such as poetry has.
Mm. Was he a good poet as such? I mean, you've read it.
Was he a good poet? Probably not. No. He, I think he was good at capturing a mood and good at finding intelligent ways to reach a mass audience with his message. But I'm always a bit scared of the question of good poetry, because who's to judge?
Right.
We sit here in our ivory towers and talk about good poetry and bad poetry. Perhaps if it reaches the masses, if they start to recite, if they learn it, if they memorize it, if it reaches their hearts, maybe that is good poetry.
It didn't reach your heart.
It didn't reach my heart, but I'm not the target audience.
Right. Right. But at the height of the Arab Spring, it had a popular support that these jihadists can only dream of, I think. And then now we're back to a situation where it's more holy war than democracy, actually, in the Middle East. So what went wrong there with
how did that happen?
With that tendency?
That's a very good question. If we knew the precise answer to that, I think we'd all be extremely clever people. I think maybe it's helpful to focus on our understanding of democracy being perhaps a little too blinkered. If you're trying to suggest a democracy in countries where there is no experience of democracy and there's a low level of education, I think it's quite natural that people would vote for those whom they trust, rather than reading long manifestos of policies and voting for how they think those might play out in future. They're much more likely to vote for people whom they have an affinity with, either because they're part of their tribe or part of their family, or part of their religion or part of their sect, rather than the way we would vote, in theory at least, which would be a policy-based vote. And so, for example, let's use a very simple example of Iraq. This big idea of bringing democracy to Iraq. If you bring democracy to a country where there's a Shiite majority, the likelihood is you're going to get a Shiite government, and that government might perhaps seek revenge or seek power that is not inclusive. What we forget is elections are the beginning. Having free and fair elections is not the end of a process. It's just the start. Then you still need a government that's inclusive and that's going to bring in all the different bits of the population, sectarian, women, youth, minorities, and then you might have something that works.
Right. But the way you describe it, it's rather the tribal social structure that's the problem than Islam, for instance, in itself.
Yes, tribal structures, social structures in some countries where those concepts still matter, they are a problem. There are many problems. Of course, education is another problem. Training in statecraft, in government is another problem. An uneducated population where loyalties are not policy-based is another problem. Islam itself, I don't think we can blame that. You're right. No, I wouldn't blame Islam.
Right. But obviously the Western intervention in Iraq didn't play out very well, as you mentioned. And it was quite naive on the part of the Americans in particular. But it was also quite surprising, I think, that the British government went along with this, considering the history of Britain in the area, having tried to make sense of Mesopotamia 100 years earlier. What do you think of that? Did they have bad advisors or bad knowledge of history, Tony Blair and his colleagues?
I think Tony Blair had quite good advisors. The problem was he didn't listen to them.
Right.
Well, who am I to say? I'm not at the centre of government. I don't know what happened.
Right.
But I know that there are plenty of people in the UK who were able to perhaps not predict, but to suggest that there could be several problems down the road. What I think is incredible is that when the recent Maliki government was in power, and when it was perhaps grabbing too much power for itself, alienating the Sunni tribes, that we were so slow to react to that we had to wait until an entity like Islamic State emerged and forged alliances with Sunni tribes in order to wake up and think, oh, the government's not working. How do we assist Iraqis, if they want it, in creating a more inclusive government that is more able to govern the country as a whole rather than just part of it? Why did we wait so long?
Right. But you've been active on the field, also in Yemen, for instance, on the Arab Peninsula. That might seem like a long leap for an Oxford scholar studying poetry and then playing almost a political role in Yemen, trying to unite feuding tribes and so on. How did that happen?
Well, of course, my research in Yemen is not political. It's about poetry and literature. It just happens that when I've been in Yemen and I've been so wonderfully cared for and looked after by local populations, particularly in Al-Mahra, in the eastern part of Yemen, when you invited into a community like that, discussions happen, and I was aware that these areas had been grossly marginalized over the decades since the 1960s, when South Yemen was created in some governorates, such as Al-Mahra, by force and not by consent. How do these people have a say in the future of Yemen? How do they create a voice that's legitimate and credible? And so, by their invitation, I started to help some elements within the Al-Mahra region think about those kinds of problems and how to tackle them. I didn't go into Yemen with an idea of doing political research, because that would be a very arrogant thing to do and probably quite dangerous.
Right. But among other things, you made a big survey asking some 2,000 people. And one question was what role poetry was playing in their everyday lives. And a startling 74% or so said that it played a very important role.
That's right.
And I thought in the UK or in Sweden, if you asked that question, probably it would be 1/10 that number. So what does that tell you about the Yemeni society?
So what's going on? Why did we have such an incredible result? You're right, 74% of my, I think, quite rigorously scientifically randomized sample of over 2,000 tribesmen and women from the eastern part of Yemen said that poetry was either very important or important in their lives on a scale of 5 answers. How did that happen? Well, I think your point about if we asked that question in Europe, we wouldn't get an answer like that. It's very unlikely. But if you asked a question, how important is listening to music, or how important is song, particularly in Sweden and Finland,
Right.
As I gather from my colleagues yesterday, you might get a similar answer: pop music, or amongst a young population, rap lyrics.
Right.
And if you think about that, or if you think about songs, poems put to song and watched on YouTube, you're starting to understand the kind of social and cultural role that poetry still has.
Yeah, it's universal. It's universal in that sense, but it takes different forms, perhaps.
That's right. And I have to confess, I asked a similar question in Egypt in 2011. It wasn't quite the same question, and the response was 6% of the population in Egypt felt that poetry was important or very important. That was shocking to me, because that was shockingly low.
But they have Facebook, Twitter now, right?
Well, maybe they of course, have a more urban population with greater access to different kinds of culture. And I think what might have happened, because of course we do see poetry very active in the Egyptian Revolution, I think what might have happened is that people didn't recognize it as poetry. They didn't understand that what they were chanting in the streets were lines by a Tunisian poet, Ashabi, or that things that they were singing were actually the poetry of Ahmed Fouad Nigam put to music. Maybe they didn't realize it.
Right. But in the Arab Peninsula, al-Qaeda, they are using jihadi poetry as a tool for recruitment and so on. How does that work?
Well, I think al-Qaeda has been incredibly clever. It's understood that a strong way of engaging the local population is to use elements of the culture that the local population does and responds to, that resonates with it. And one of these is poetry. So, for example, I've been investigating the publications of al-Qaeda. It brought out a journal called Sada al-Malahim, the Echo of Epic Battles, which came out for 4 years until the start of the Arab Spring, well, actually a little bit into the start. And I went through this rigorously and discovered that a fifth of it, 19% of the pages in this journal, contain poetry of some sort. Wow, how is that? If a fifth of the pages contain poetry, it must be for a reason. It's not just for fun. It's not space filler. It's because it addresses people's hearts and minds. It's easy to memorize, and it's able to therefore spread amongst the population.
Low-tech, so it's very reliable.
Exactly, in a low-tech way, where you've got no print culture in the deserts, or very little. You don't really have internet access that easily. How does the message spread? It's memorized.
Right.
And so when the print culture disappears, when the websites are taken down, when as we now have, Twitter feeds they get taken down, the Facebook pages are taken, what remains? The memory and the oral narrative, and that's the poetry.
Right. There is a fantastic video on YouTube from Yemen with you addressing some 260 armed tribesmen, I think.
Yes.
Why did you put yourself in that position, and what did you learn from it?
Actually, that position was a surprise to me as well. I only discovered that I was going to address this large crowd of armed tribesmen about 5 minutes before. What I thought was happening was that we were driving to a location in the eastern region of Al-Mahra in order to watch an election process. I was observing a process of indirect elections for a council, what they would call a majlis, al-Majlis al-Mahri, which is a council of elected representatives to help gather views in order to feed through to the regional and national governments and international governments. But as the election day began, they said, Doctora, why don't you come and address this group? Tell us what's going on. Tell us about your survey. So I didn't really have time to think about whether it was dangerous or not. I just did it.
It seems to work very well on YouTube, but you being a woman and also a scholar from Oxford and thinking about Britain's colonial past in the area and so on, did it make it difficult to connect with these people?
Actually, in this particular area of Yemen, they seem to have a very positive recollection of the colonial past under the British, except, of course, for the very end of the colonial era, because what happened was that Britain pulled out early from an agreement to protect what was at that point in time the East Aden Protectorate, and Al-Mahra and Hadramaut were part of that. But when Britain decided to renege on its treaty in 1967, then the tribes in this area were overrun by Marxist, let's not call them Marxists, let's call them socialists,
right,
who were keen, naturally, on independence, but didn't try to achieve their aims in a very consensual way. But Britain, as such, seems to be remembered in a positive way. And at the end of that election day, just before the tribesmen drove me to a safe place, we stopped and they made a campfire, and they, off the cuff, had a poetry session in two groups, like a joust, like a competition.
DJ battle.
Yes, exactly, almost like a rap battle, the kind of thing you see in Eminem's 8 Mile film. One group declaiming one line, and then the other group, when that group tires, the second group would take up the poem and create another line. And it's almost a test of stamina, physical and voice stamina.
And wit, yeah.
And the topic of that poetry, the reason I mention it, was a glorification of the British that they were doing spontaneously.
Incredible.
Probably to flatter me, but
Yeah.
I felt also with some genuine, I hope, emotion there.
Right.
And that was amazing.
And the dialect in that area, as you mentioned earlier, it's quite different from Egypt, where you spent your earlier days of study. But could you follow that spontaneous rap session? The language?
I could follow it because the line was repeated so frequently.
Right.
I'm not going to claim to be an expert on Mahri, which actually it's not a dialect of Arabic. It's its own language. It's one of 6 modern Southern Arabian languages, which is not written, but it has its own grammar, its own vocabulary, and it's not mutually intelligible with Arabic. So I rely on some of the tribesmen who do know Arabic. In fact, 1 or 2 of them have learnt a little bit of English. And I was astonished to discover, I'm sorry, I'm going off track slightly here, but
No.
it's a funny story, that the most educated people whom I met, and I'm not going to claim this as a general statement, but on this particular occasion, the reason they were educated, the reason they knew a little bit of English and quite good Arabic, was because they'd been in prison in Oman.
Right.
And this had given them the opportunity to have the kind of education which they are not given inside Al-Mahra, inside Yemen.
Right.
Even though there are schools and colleges, you can't find good qualified staff in quantities necessary to tackle the education dilemma there.
Right.
And so, to me, it was amazing that the best education you could get would be in an Omani prison. And the reason they were there, by the way, wasn't for terrorism. It was because there's a very vibrant smuggling economy.
Okay, we have to stop there.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the
Thank
talk.
you. It's a
Elisabeth.
pleasure. Thank you.